Welcome all to Ruminations, powered by the SU Imaginarium. My name is Jason Ting. I'll be your host for today. Before I get into introduce my guest, I just want to give a huge shout out to the SU Psych Department for appearing on my podcast 3 episodes in a row. It's quite nice to have that kind of support and be able to have these great conversations. So without a further ado, I want to introduce my guest for today. He was my learning psychology professor back in the fall quarter of my senior year. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Bell. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me. And I'm the third, am I?
Yeah. The first was Dr. Whitfield. Second
Excellent.
was Dr. Simone, and then you are the third. So
I'm in good company.
yeah, we've kind of got a little chain going on here. So, just to get into the swing of things, you are you specialize in learning psychology, correct?
Yeah, I would call it behavior analysis.
Behavioral analysis?
That's more of what people use these days.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, learning theory.
Gotcha. So, explain to me sort of what does that entail? What is that really? Since I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions around what learning psychology or behavioral analysis really is.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, in the history of psychology, without giving you too much excruciating detail, psychology went through these phases of what really is the subject matter. And early psychology, it was very subjective. The idea was, let's introspect on what we think and what we feel. And that's not, it's hard to be empirical in that context. And so as often happens in science, there's a reaction to that. And the reaction was the behavioral movement, who came along and said, all that introspection, internal stuff, we can't do anything with, and it's not scientific. So we reject all of it. Mm-hmm. And the internal mental world, as it were, is irrelevant. And that set in motion the behavioral movement, where that was sort of the way people thought about things for quite a while in psychology, more or less. And the reaction to that, of course, somewhat later in the 60s, 70s was, well, we can actually do science on the mental. Mm-hmm. And out of that was born cognitive psychology. And, along the same lines, things in biological psychology, neuroscience were also happening to get to the supposed internal world. Mm-hmm. So these things have developed sort of in parallel, and the behavioral approach has grown in some respects and shrunk in some respects. So the basic research stuff has really shrunk in the last decade, but the applied world is huge. So people use behavior analysis in the real world, quote unquote, outside of academia, mostly for interventions with people with autism.
Mm-hmm. So sort of when we look at behavioral psych, it's sort of this, I guess, in between the sort of the beginnings of psychology that were more emotionally focused, and then we sort of moved to a rejection of that with behavioral or the behavioral focus, and then that sort of developed into cognitive psych, neuroscience, where we're sort of backtracking and saying, oh wait, we can't actually do science on like the way that we think.
Right. And I mean, that's certainly the way people think about it. I think that's often a little misguided. I mean, I think part of what's happening is people are starting to use internal events as causal mechanisms rather than responses in and of themselves.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah, I actually remember you bringing that up in class one time, where you were sort of saying, when we're looking at behavior, thoughts don't really matter, or you can't look at thoughts as sort of, how do I put it? You can't sort of look at it as the cause to behavior. It's sort of happening at the same time, which I found particularly interesting, because as human beings, I feel like we tend to say, oh yeah, I think about something and my thoughts sort of influence that. But then the behavioral approach is sort of, they're happening at the same time. So it's not necessarily that one's causing the other.
Well, maybe more accurately, we don't know the sequence of events. So one possibility, which I think is sort of the common thinking about it, sort of the popular version, is you think and then you do. Mm-hmm. Right. And so what's causing the doing is the thinking. So goes that position. The behavioral position, my position is, well, let's think about that. In the first place, the thinking is something we can't do science on, not directly, right? I can't,
Right.
none of us can see it or measure it directly. And so we have to do it through some other means. And that's a problem. And the other part is we don't really know the sequencing of these things. That's the second problem. The third problem is thinking is in and of itself a behavior.
Right. Yeah, I think that honestly was the most interesting part for me. Sort of looking at, the thoughts that I have aren't necessarily just I guess, sort of independent in their own space. They're also being influenced by the same things that my own behaviors are being influenced by. So I guess, I don't know. It's sort of really interesting to look at psychology and behavior that way, since we're so thought-centered that sort of breaking out of that is really strange. And, sorry, were you about to say something?
No, you're right. It is strange. But to me, it speaks to utility, really. Like, how do I go about influencing your thinking? I directly, I don't know.
Right.
And if one was to influence your thinking, presumably what you would do is change something in your world. And I don't know how that would be any different than a behavioral approach, except that you're inferring this internal thing going on. And I don't know that that's helpful.
Right.
Right? I don't see the utility of that, because ultimately what I really want to do is change what you're doing.
Right.
Right? So if we were to talk about something problematic like racism, do I really care what you're thinking? Well, yeah, I do, but I more care what you do.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. We're oftentimes focused on like the thought, but I do feel like if the thought never is expressed in action, then why does the thought matter?
I don't think it does.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really interesting way to sort of look at behavior like that, and I do think part of the thought center, or like the thought centered perspective that we have, at least I feel like, is we sort of have a little bit of pride as humans that we can actually we are autonomous and we control our own behaviors.
Yes.
And I think the thing that was really interesting to me about that was, when we're doing a lot of research studying on behavior, we're usually doing it on animals. And you would think, oh yeah, when you study an animal, it's different than studying humans because we have reasoning, we have a bunch of higher level functioning that animals don't have. But then we still see, certain things do parallel, certain things do cross over.
True.
Just to sort of move into that, how much of, studying animal behavior do you think really translates over to like human behavior? Because some of it obviously does, but then there's some that doesn't, and it's weird to really see what does and what doesn't.
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, there's several ways to look at that. One is sometimes people don't care at all about what humans do, and they're only interested in animal behavior. I mean, those people tend to be more biology focused, right?
Right.
They're interested in how does this particular starling behave under these conditions. And so there the questions have nothing to do with humans. As a psychology person or a behavior person, the goal of doing the animal research is to find those commonalities, to find those places where we as organisms have common learning processes. And so the early behavior people, they were really basing their animal work on the idea that it would translate. Does it always? No. There's lots of examples where it doesn't, which makes for really interesting research that people just, I don't think, are doing because the field is small and it's hard to do. And the other piece of, so the third sort of area that people have gone into is to go look at animals. And I find this stuff interesting. I'm not really an expert in it, but I know some examples of, they study animals with the goals of finding out, can animals do things that would be sort of higher order kinds of things that humans could do. And we would think that animals couldn't do it. Things like some language, things like counting.
Right, right.
Things like relations above and below, those sorts of things. And it turns out, if you do the experiment in the right way, you can often reveal that animals are incredibly sophisticated and complex in ways that really surprised me. For example, one specific example are I think they're New Caledonian crows. This was published years and years ago, and what they found is that these crows would use tools to get things, and that's some animals do that. That's not super surprising. What was surprising is they would approach a problem and create a tool to solve the problem.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was just amazing to see, and so you wouldn't know about that ability of the crow unless the experiment had been designed in a particular way. Mm-hmm. And so being able to tease out the abilities of these special abilities of animals to do these things that really look higher functioning is quite an art, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, it's sort of how, in class we talk a lot about shaping and, building up behaviors to sort of to see how complex that they can really become, especially when you think about the natural environment. Obviously, there are instances in which that higher level functioning needs to exist. For instance, with humans, we had to build tools in order to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. But a lot of animals don't really have to do that, so it's hard to really see how much they're really capable of. And I do feel like, learning about behavioral psych and just psychology in general, we realize we're not that different from animals. There are obviously some things that we do have that animals don't, but at the same time, animals have a lot of things that we have that we're just not aware of.
Well, and they do lots of things that we can't.
Right, right.
Right. I mean, I can't fly.
Neither can I.
I wish I could.
But, that's what we make planes for, right? So we can. Also to sort of branch off of that, you do, or at least did, a lot of research regarding pigeons, right?
Yes.
And when we talked a lot in class, we focused a lot on pigeons, the behavior of pigeons, birds. And, with all of the various animals that you can do research on, mice, dogs, cats, guinea pigs, mm-hmm. It's pretty much endless. What drew you to the pigeon?
So I don't think I was drawn to the pigeon. The pigeon, how do I think about this? So in the history of the research field, rats, pigeons, and mice were the subjects of choice.
Right.
And I think part of the reason they were chosen early on is that they were considered vermin. And so nobody would care if you took them off of the streets and used them in experiments. That's, of course, since changed. Mm-hmm. And people are much more aware of animal rights issues and doing good animal stewardship. The reason I do pigeon work is when I started grad school, I went to a program that did pigeon work. And I went in and I thought, there's no way on earth I'm going to do pigeon work. That sounds awful to me. I'm never going to do that. And of course, that's changed. Something about it. I tried it and I liked it and I enjoyed it. And so I kept with it. So really my doing of pigeons was a function of I'd had some experience doing that. So I had some expertise in it. Mm-hmm. And it's what the field used quite often as a subject. So there's the ability to communicate with other people in the field about like studies mm-hmm. with the same species. And the other option for me would have been rats. And I'm allergic to rats.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
I did a postdoc where I worked with rats, and the longer I worked with them, the more allergic I became, so that I couldn't handle them by the end of my postdoc. Which makes it hard to do animal work if you can't actually work with the participants.
Right, right. So it's just so happened that, you learned about pigeons, you did pigeon work, and it just happens to fit for you.
Yeah, and that all happened by accident, frankly.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Also, too, that you sort of mentioned that, the go-to for a long time has been rats, mice, and pigeons. I guess, the follow-up to that then is there a better animal to use in that sort of lab work, or is it just so happens that our research has been optimized so much to those three animals that there's not really a reason to drift too far beyond that?
I think it depends upon what your research question is. Mm-hmm. Pigeons aren't used as much anymore. So that's less common. Mostly now rats and mice. And part of the reason rats and mice is the brain structures are well understood, and they're often used in neurobio kinds of experiments where they'll do some kind of measurement of the brain or injury to the brain or inject some substance and measure brain changes as well.
Right.
And that's just sort of a gold standard for, gold standards may be the wrong word. It's a standard species that people use, but other people have used all kinds of animals in research. There was a guy at UT Austin who used Japanese quail, and he used them because he was interested in Pavlovian conditioning, and he was interested in how Pavlovian conditioning affected their sexual signaling behavior. And for whatever reason, that turned out to be a really good species for doing that. And I don't know that he actually cared about the quail as a subject per se, but it gave a robust model for understanding Pavlovian conditioning.
Interesting. Yeah, wow. I guess, when you think so much about animals, at least for me, sort of the assumption is that all animals are generally the same, or at least exhibit similar behavior. So it's pretty interesting to sort of hear that, if you're researching a specific thing, then you can look for a species that elicits a specific behavior that you're looking for, or at least is optimized for that specific behavior.
Yeah, sometimes that's true. And if you're doing brain work, there are also breeds of mice and rats that are bred for either specific conditions or to be models of specific things. So, for example, you might have rats or mice that are bred to exhibit symptoms that are thought to be correlated with what autism would look like. And so you have quote unquote autistic mice or autistic rats. Is that perfect? No, not by any stretch, but it is the way the field of at least neurobio kinds of psych things have gone.
I'd also have to imagine the ethical implications behind that must be pretty murky as well. Like breeding mice to have some sort of, I don't want to say disorder, but condition.
Yeah, that's an ethical consideration. What researchers have to do if they're at a university is have their research reviewed by an animal care and use committee, which is a group of individuals, both animal researchers, people from the community, a vet, and a number of other people to evaluate the ethical considerations of animal welfare.
Right.
So that's the mechanism by which at least universities and places that do it as businesses use to monitor the ethical considerations and worry about the well-being of the animals.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to pivot to, talking about not only your work in research, but also as professor.
Sure.
I'd have to imagine that you're in a pretty unique position being a behavioral analyst, studying behavior while also teaching, college classes. I guess what I'm wondering is, does your research in any way influence the way you teach, or does the way you teach maybe influence the way that you research? What's the overlap there, if there's any?
The research influences teaching. Definitely. When I design a class, I think a lot about what are the behavioral principles at play and how can I coordinate the class so that it tries to maximize the opportunities for students to learn. Which isn't to say it does maximize it. I mean, there are compromises because quarters are 10 weeks long. That's a constraint.
Right.
I only have so many hours in my day that I can dedicate to my teaching. That's a constraint. There's only so much that I should be asking students to do because they have busy lives and have other things to do. So those things kind of constrain the space you can play in. But I think a lot about that. One of the examples I talk about often when I teach is the notion of giving a midterm and a final as a mechanism. I might have talked about that in our class. And the idea is if you give just a midterm and a final, then what that does is it tells students when they should be studying is just before the midterm and just before the final.
Right.
And I will hear in the past, I don't know that I've heard this recently, but I've heard professors say, why don't my students do more studying? To which my answer is I don't tell them this, but my answer is it's how you've arranged the class.
Right.
You've set up the class so that they will study before the midterm and before the final. Mm-hmm. Well, if I don't want that behavior to happen, then I should arrange the class differently.
Right. Though I definitely agree with you, speaking from, I guess, experience.
We both have that experience.
I've also tended to, cram my studying, as I'm sure many other students have. Though I guess, when you think about the alternative, if you really want to introduce, the random scheduling and sort of motivate more consistent studying, then the question is, well, are you just supposed to give pop quizzes all the time? Is that the answer? Because I do feel like while it will definitely motivate more studying, the kind of emotional, mental stress that puts on students, well, now we've got a little bit of a trade-off here.
Well, yes. So I don't do pop quizzes, but I also think it depends upon how you implement it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if they were lower stakes quizzes, like they didn't make or break your grade, and if you did poorly, there was a remedy for that, mm-hmm. then I would be okay with pop quizzes. Other than, it would make my life more difficult as an instructor to coordinate that. Right. And I'm not motivated to do that. Because, I have, as you know, scheduled lots of regular assessments within a class. Right. And students know when they are, and students can remedy them when they go badly. And I think that's a pretty good system. It's fitting within the constraints of the system of 10 weeks, my time, their time, and trying to be respectful of all of those parameters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you also mentioned, 10 weeks being a restraint, right? And I guess that also comes into question quarter versus semester system. I think semester system is usually 12 or 13 weeks, plus obviously finals week at the end. So I guess what I'm wondering then is, obviously the quarter system lets you take a lot more classes, lets you sort of experiment a lot more, but maybe the semester system is better for actually getting information out or developing a more robust class?
Well, you can certainly go more depth. When I design classes, I worry about what do you include and what do you exclude, and I make hard choices about this I find really to be cool, but I also know we only have a certain amount of time, so I'm not going to talk about this, whatever this is.
Right.
I don't know that semesters, I don't know. I don't know that anybody's looked at that. I can tell you about one study that I did with Dr. Simone and Dr. McNellis in the chemistry department. We did this study, I don't know, this has been a few years ago. Dr. McNellis was teaching chemistry in the summer and during the regular academic year. And so we looked at performance of students in the summer session versus performance of students in the regular academic year. So this doesn't quite get at the semester quarter question, but the summer classes are compressed relative to regular 10-week classes. So it's sort of an analog, right?
Right.
And what we found in that study was that the students who took it in summer on a follow-up test performed less well than students who took it during the regular academic year. Mm-hmm. The idea being simply spacing out your learning leads to better remembering later on.
Right. Yeah, I do also think, I mean, it's obviously dependent on the format, but I think summer also gives a lot of leeway to, I guess, not be as focused in class as you normally would be. Also, doubly so, a lot of summer classes have been moving just purely online after COVID, I think makes a pretty big difference. Right. But I do think it's interesting how, you can cram a bunch of information from 10 weeks into 5 weeks for the summer sessions, but it doesn't feel like you're getting as complete of the experience, which, obviously, because you have less time. But I guess then what I'm wondering is there any way to improve the way that we're sort of doing classes within our 10-week format without having to add more time and given the constraints?
Sure. Yes, that's the short answer. But to me, it comes back to what's your objective too. Mm-hmm. So if you're teaching a class, Is your goal to cover as much content as possible? Is your goal to engage students in other kinds of things that are not directly related to content, like practicing public speaking or working on critical thinking kinds of skills where they're having to read something and evaluate the veracity of it, something like that. So it sort of depends upon what do you want to do as an instructor. And in the university system, that's pretty much up to each instructor.
Right.
And so, like for me, for example, I've chosen to spend part of the time in my classes worrying about having students work on a little bit of public speaking, a little bit of critical thinking, and that's at the cost of content coverage.
Right.
But I think in the grand scheme of things, that's probably in their best interest as opposed to me just cramming content into the class. I mean, there have been some studies that looked at how much do people remember after their college classes, and they did this longitudinal study that's really fascinating. They did a couple of them looking at how much do they remember from, I forget, maybe a Spanish language class or some kind of language class 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years out from having taken the course. Mm-hmm. And it's a forgetting curve. So you start out high and very quickly it drops off and then plateaus.
Right.
And so if my goal is content only, it's going to be lost pretty quickly, no matter whether it's 10 weeks, whether it's 14 weeks, whether it's summer class, it's going to be lost pretty quickly. And so should that be my only objective? Maybe not. Mm-hmm. And that's a trade-off. And I think that that's something that people now in higher education think about much more than they used to.
Yeah. I definitely get that a lot, especially with, I feel like a lot of the classes that I've taken in college, unless there's something that I find really important to a career that I want to pursue in the future, I tend not to remember what I actually learned in it. Mm-hmm. But what I do usually take away from is, I guess the experiences of trying something new, developing a skill set, more so than necessarily class material. I noticed this a lot in your class, actually, where I feel like in terms of, going really into content or learning a lot of content, we didn't really have that. But, mm-hmm. What we did have a lot was, let's look at a study and let's dissect it. Let's read graphs. Let's think about what the data means. And, this sort of harkens back to something I was talking about with Dr. Whitfield before, where we were sort of discussing, how can we train people to not just be scientists, but be scientifically minded, to think critically more, to, sort of dissect information better. Mm-hmm. And especially when we consider, the digital age. There's so much information. There's so much stimuli sort of going out. It's hard to really filter through the mess and find what really matters.
Yep.
So I'm sure there are a lot of people who would prefer to just go all content and really mm-hmm. learn in depth about, certain topics. But I do think now more than ever, it is really important to build out skill sets and build out specifically critical thinking, especially when in a time when I feel like it's sort of being lost almost.
That certainly seems to be true. Yeah, I agree with you. And that's something that I think about a lot and talk with my colleagues about. I mean, Dr. Whitfield and I have lots of conversations about these sorts of things, and she and I are pretty like-minded in that way. It doesn't serve you well, I don't think, you as students to just worry about content. Right. And that doesn't mean we should become a vocational school, right? We shouldn't be teaching you how to just do mechanics, but learning how to be a critical thinker, learning how to use a computer and not be afraid of it, learning how to put yourself out there in unusual situations and be okay doing that. I think that's super important. And those are skills that will apply no matter what you do. Because not everybody who, for example, is a psych major goes on to get a PhD in psych.
Right.
I mean, why would we want that anyway? That doesn't make any sense to want that. I don't think that's any of our objectives as instructors here. So what is the objective? And I think that is sort of in the arena of the Santa Clara ethos of training you to be good people. I'm broadly speaking, people for others.
Right, right. Yeah, this actually reminds me of I don't remember who I had this with, but a conversation that I had with someone where college is less about, or nowadays is less about sort of you do college and then you go into a career. Once people go into a career nowadays, they tend to be a lot more fluid. They might not go into the same thing that they originally thought they might go into. Their major is less of, a definitive path to life anymore, as it is so much, just your starting point. This is where you are starting out, but now you've got so many different options. We think about psych, for instance. Psych can go in regards to therapy, clinical psychology, psychiatry, UX, marketing.
Human resources.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
lots
so
of places.
broad now that I feel like the role of the instructor or the teacher, the professor, is sort of changing now. It's less so much of let's teach you content and prepare you for a career, but more so let's prepare you for life. That also being said, I don't think the education system has sort of caught up to that change. We're so focused on the grade, the test, very traditional styles of education that it feels like, academia, or not academia, but education is sort of lagging a little behind in regards to that change. Maybe it's just me, though. I'm not sure.
Well, that's certainly something people seem to talk about in higher ed. I mean, I follow that a little bit. And there's lots of ways in which people now try to break that mold. Part of what happens, so from a behavior analytic perspective, what's happening is grades are very important in high school in particular because they are the coin of the realm to get into college.
Right.
And higher grades are important, and the idea of getting higher grades is reinforced by the parents of you need to get good grades, particularly here at Santa Clara, right? There's a bar for getting into Santa Clara, and so the students who come here tend to have been academically strong, right?
Right.
And so that means they have this history of grade getting is important.
Right.
They get to the university, and the system changes, and even though the system changes, so the system changes in that high school and college are often very different for students. And one of the effects of that is their grades go down while they learn how to be here.
Right.
That's a challenge. But then they work on learning how to get better grades. But they're still grade focused.
Right.
And we perpetuate that too. Faculty perpetuate that. And the question is, what does that serve? What's the end of that? And I don't know what the answer is. Because for most people, if you get out of the university with a bachelor's degree and you go into the professional world, who's looking at your grades? Almost no one.
Right.
They're going to see you have a degree or not have a degree, and they're going to choose based on that. So grades don't really matter. And so how do you break that? And that's a tough problem. That's a really hard problem. I try to do that. I mean, my courses are now moving toward designs to try and break that. And part of the reason that I worry about that is it becomes an issue of equity, really, because students that are less prepared as academics tend to be students that are either from a diversity group or they're first-gen students. And so they come in without the kind of tools that most students will have, students that have parents that went to college, that went to schools that trained them on some of these mechanics. And so the grade thing is a disadvantage for those students, I think. And I want to break that.
Right. Yeah, I think, especially when we look at high school, the SATs, AP courses, things that are very expensive, but also very much do prepare you for college and do give you a head start. For instance, AP courses literally give you college credit, and that's something that you have to pay a lot of money for. You also have to be in the school district or go to a school that offers those courses, and then you also have to be in a situation where either you study hard enough or you have a really good class or a really good tutor that can get you that 4 or the 5 to, get that credit. Though I do have to wonder too, I don't really know how to put this. Colleges obviously have a finite set of resources and a finite space to take care of students. So there has to be some way to differentiate them.
Why?
I mean, for instance, I look at Santa Clara, right? Santa Clara definitely has a lot of money. They also, to be frank, don't want to spend it on bringing more students here. So there's a finite set of students that Santa Clara can take.
Right.
So then how do they choose them if not by grades? And I think that's where, the big struggle lies here is the exclusivity of college comes from grades. And to take that out of the equation, well, they don't really have anything then, unless you just count personal statement and teacher recommendations, which I do think, are very, very powerful in their own right. But when you're dealing with so many applicants.
Yeah, no, I don't know. That's something I don't know anything about and don't want to have anything to do with, to be completely honest. Student admissions is a complicated process, and I don't understand it and have no interest in it.
Right.
Like from my perspective, it's about once students are here,
right.
we have a diverse group of students with different sets of experiences. And what can I be doing in that context to really level the playing field is the wrong term of phrase, but make it things so that everybody can be successful if they put in the energy.
Right. I'm actually glad that, going through your class versus going through other classes that might be a little more grade focused, I do have to say that it's nice to just be able to put in the effort, learn at my own pace, and still get a grade rather than saying, okay, I need to keep up, do a very specific set of things, and potentially, downgrade my education in order to get a grade. At least that's what I feel like I've been trained to do is sometimes if you have to take a shortcut, then you take the shortcut. And it sometimes, ruins the class. I don't want to say it like that, but there are times when I want to focus on the material and it feels like I can't. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma to deal with.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting to me as an instructor to try and figure out that space.
Right.
I mean, I'm motivated to make it interesting both for students and for myself. That drives a lot of how I think about course development is what is it that I want them to be able to do, and how do I get them to do that in a way that's not punitive? Right.
And at the same time, how do you have enough of, the punitive aspect to where students still feel motivated? Because then there's a lot of people are sort of conditioned to only focus on the grade. And if the grade isn't there, or if the class is too grade lenient, then they tend to, slack off a bit or not try as much. I feel like.
Yeah. Well, I think my sense is, I don't have data on this, but my sense is you can arrange the class in a way that you use other kinds of natural contingencies. So, for example, having people stand at the front of the room and talk about something. So if you're not getting a grade for talking about this idea, so let's say that I'm going to ask you to talk about shaping. And I say, okay, well, next class I'm going to randomly choose somebody to come up and explain shaping. And it's not going to be graded. I'm just going to choose people.
Right.
The people who come will have prepared. And it has nothing to do with a grade. It has everything to do with the social dynamics of you want to look like you know what you're doing when you're at the front of the class.
Right.
Right. And that does a couple of things. It changes the structure of the assignment in that it's not grade focused. And it changes it in a way that I like because it gets people public speaking, which is something students struggle with.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that a lot when, we were doing the propedeutic final project where we had to present some topic in front of the class and basically teach our own mini lesson. What I noticed was the grading on that was pretty lenient, but there was still, this drive to do something good, just purely off, I don't necessarily say social pressure, but basically social pressure.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anything bad with that, because it's not like it's a make or break kind of thing either.
Right.
Right? It's a pretty gentle nudging, if you will. And I know that happens because students have a history of wanting to perform in a certain way in front of others.
Right.
Right? And that drives behavior. Why not leverage that? I mean, the other way to arrange that is to make it worth points.
Right.
And I've done that. I don't know that it works better. In fact, I think it works better if it's for the sake of doing it.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I like to pivot again and sort of talk about conditioning and I guess the grand scheme of the real world. I feel like, especially given our increasingly digital age, there's a lot of ways that, things will play to psychology in toxic ways. Look at something like video game monetization, social media algorithms. They play off of these very basic behavioral instincts. And I guess what I'm wondering is there a way that we can either regulate those practices, or are we just, meant to hold that? Is that just something that we're going to have to just say, yeah, we're going to eventually be a slave to these practices just because they prey on just inherent parts of the way that we behave?
Well, should the government regulate it? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a government person in that sense.
Right.
Do I think that these companies have come to understand how contingencies work? Yeah. I don't know that they would be able to express that, but yeah, I think they've definitely learned that. But that's true of lots of professions.
Right.
The gambling industry also understands how contingencies work,
Right.
and have been very successful at leveraging that. So do I think that that's going to remain true? Yeah, I think it is. And from my perspective, one of the tools that we have is for people to understand how behavior works. Because if you don't understand how contingencies work to affect your behavior, then if we all agree that those things work, that they're in action, and you don't know how they work, you're at the mercy of them.
Right.
If you understand the dynamics, you at least can identify that, and you can then arrange or have others help you arrange situations so that you do less of that thing you don't want to do, or do more of that thing you want to do, whatever that is. I mean, in simple sense, if what you want to do is to go to the gym more often, you can either lament the fact that you don't go to the gym, which doesn't change your behavior, or you can change the situation. So, for example, we could agree that we'll meet at the gym every morning when they open, and just that simple social contract will get you there more often than not. Right? So if you and I said, all right, tomorrow we're both going to get to the gym at 6:30 and we're going to go for 20 minutes on a treadmill together, then we would likely do that.
Right. Yeah, so I guess in that regard, it's sort of knowledge is power, right?
I think so, yeah. Which gets back to the education thing, right? What do you want people to learn in a class? And in terms of the sort of upper division content courses, it's that sort of thing. You can, if you can understand it, you can affect change.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, the difficulty then is, how do you get people, I don't want to necessarily say motivated, but how do you make enough people aware of those sorts of things where they can actually protect themselves? Because I do feel like in the realm of psychology, but also just in general nowadays, it's very difficult to get people to really learn about things anymore. And especially when we think about, what does social media do? What does gambling do to you? What are these conditioning principles that affect you?
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of not just like a lack of awareness to those sorts of things, but I also feel like some people are unwilling, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
now that it's commonplace, let's just let it happen. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go about things, right?
Well, I don't like it, but I don't know that I have much influence there. I mean, through the pandemic, there was so much influence on behavior around things like getting vaccinated,
Right.
right? And there became this sort of social feedback loop for people to not get vaccinated.
Right.
And how do you push back against that? That's a hard problem. And understanding the fundamentals of behavior provides you a starting point, but it's much more complex than that.
Right.
The dynamics are hard to understand, I think. And yet it's so important to understand those kinds of things, right? Because don't we want everybody to get vaccinated?
Right.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult when it's not just a matter of behavioral psych, but also now there are things like social factors, cultural factors, political factors that sort of feed into those processes and continue that feedback loop. But then, it sometimes feels like it's all doom and gloom. It's just this is the boulder's going to keep rolling until it eventually crashes, and there's not much we can really do to stop it. But at the same time, I don't really think it's a great way of looking at things, right? Like you want to have some sort of hope, optimism, but
Well, yeah. I mean, when I teach the classes in behavior, the goal is to get one of the goals is to get students to realize that they can take these tools and use them. And that's a place to start change,
right,
right? And it, again, that fits with the university's outlook. Social justice is a part of what we as a university are sort of branded for doing and known for doing and should be doing more of. We encourage students to do it. We should be doing more of it. And it seems to me that that's the way I put that positive spin on it. Like my role is to try to empower students so that they can go out and affect change in the world.
right. Yeah, that definitely like it makes a lot of sense within the whole grand scheme of the university and just academia in general. I do feel like there's definitely a part of academia that feels elitist, self-perpetuating, and just very concerned about keeping it self-sustaining. But at the same time, I do feel like if there is anything that will get us out of the mess that we're sort of in right now, it is almost definitely education. There's not much else that can really do it, it feels. Maybe that's putting too much of a burden on academia and, education as a whole to really say our society is broken, fix it. But sometimes it does feel like that's going to be the saving grace, is getting ourselves educated, getting ourselves aware, and taking that and sort of bringing it to the world.
Well, the U.S. has certainly made the case that education is important, right? We've, as a country, have made the decision to support education, require education of students, not college level, but K through 12 kinds of things. And so as a culture, we should be valuing that. And it's not clear that we do.
Right.
Like there's a real tension there that I see, and I don't have the answer to it. It's super interesting to me because on the one hand, we all value education, and I mean not really college in this sense, but on the other hand, we don't really resource it well, by and large. And there's definitely inequities in how that's resourced, and all of that's a problem. And we should be teaching things like, it seems to me, like civics and health and home economics. Like teaching some basic skills in addition to teaching the things that traditionally get taught. I think those simple changes would make for a more informed citizenship. which I think we would all benefit from.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It's just kind of unfortunate that everything, no matter what it is, has sort of become politicized, especially education. Something as simple as let's fund our public schools, let's get more people in college is so hotly contested in ways that I don't think really make a lot of sense. Because while, yes, it is an investment, it is a lot of money to do that, though I don't even know if it really is. It's
It depends upon where you go and who you are.
right. But, that investment pays out in the long run because the only way to really achieve social mobility and to achieve change is through education. It's just kind of unfortunate that more and more it feels like people are fighting against it just because of the political nature of it in some way, whether it's the nature of political correctness on campus, whether it's the nature of how much money should we really put into public schools, what are people teaching in classes, are these things values that we agree with, how do we really have dialogue and conversation anymore? A lot of those a lot of those questions can really only be answered in education or in an educated space. It's kind of strange though, almost like the snake is devouring its own tail.
Well, it does. There's this notion that the academy is full of liberals,
Right.
and so the conservatives push back on that. I don't know that that's entirely true. I don't know. I don't know the answer to it, but that's some of the essence of that politicization around universities nationally, it seems to me.
Right.
And it may be the case that I don't want to say that the conservative side is right exactly, but maybe there's something to be said for the notion not everybody needs to go to college. Like, we need people to do other kinds of things other than be a psychologist or be an English teacher or whatever. We need people who can build cabinets, and we need people who can fix plumbing. And those are well-paying careers that a college track doesn't really get people to. Right. And we need those people just as much as we need anybody else in society. They're just as valuable, and we should be probably looking to foster that as an alternative to college. Because it seems to me now the sort of de facto default is one has to go to college to have a good career. And that's sort of the frame of the current time is you can't get a job out of high school that really gives you a good career. It's certainly clear that your earnings will be lower over your lifetime. There's data on this to show that your lifetime earning will be much lower if you don't go to college. So that seems sort of broken because I don't think everybody needs to go to college or even should go to college. In the same way, I don't think everybody needs to go get a PhD either. Like, the notion that that's the place everybody ought to end up seems a little elitist almost.
Right. Yeah, it definitely felt that way for a lot of my life. Granted, I do personally value higher education, and my aspirations in life I do feel like will take me through college one way or another. But I also feel like, especially within this community, it's either you go to college or you're not successful. It's your entire life builds up to college. And then once you get into college, your entire life builds up to get your degree, do whatever higher education you want to do afterwards, whether it's master's, doctorate, PhD, etc. And then from there you can achieve success. It's all through college. And I do feel like as well, when we think about, the emphasis on grades that we were talking about earlier, a lot of that is due to sort of this sanctification of college. College is great, don't get me wrong. And it's a place where a lot of amazing things can happen. But it's also not the be-all, end-all that people pretend it is. And, maybe that kind of argument, if that goes out, could maybe lessen the burden and the tension around academia. It's hard to really say, but I do feel like that sort of idea has been lost, and it would be nice to sort of bring that back and open up the options to more people.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a tangent, but we watched this show called This Old House, which is on public broadcasting. And what they've done for decades is they go in and they repair houses. And so that there'll be somebody who owns a house, and this crew will come in and record the rebuilding of the house. And one of the things that happens is you see all of these tradespeople coming in and doing all of this carpentry work, plastering work, painting work. And one of the things that they've started to do as part of their program is to bring in interns and really get on message about there are people who need to be going into the trades, because the number of people going into the trades, plumbing and carpentry and those sorts of things, is decreasing dramatically. And so there's a huge need for that.
Right.
And why aren't we doing more of that? Why aren't we normalizing that? Because being a plumber or an electrician or any of those kinds of trades are well-paying, well-respected, can bring people a good life. And if that's where their journey takes them, that's a great thing.
Right. It almost feels like there's a stigma around, all of the trades, even though we need them so desperately and we use them so often. Which, it's kind of sort of going back to that elitist mentality of college or bust. There's a lot of people in society. In fact, I would say the majority of society is probably held up by people who don't have really strong education, because those are the people who are very literally laying the bricks on which we stand on.
Yeah, and there's definitely issues of equity there. I mean, we as a country have agreed that there's a whole sort of group of people who are going to be paid less for the work they do. And these were, I think, the frontline workers during the pandemic, many of them. They're underpaid and underappreciated. And that's even true in education. I mean, you think about how much we pay teachers. And we put lip service to how important teachers are. And again, I don't mean college level. We give lip service to how important teachers are, but they're not well paid. They're not well compensated.
Right.
And the same's true for people who work at jobs that, serve us, work at restaurants, work in food service industry, who work in the hotel industry, cleaning rooms. Those folks are woefully undercompensated relative to what we ought to be doing, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Especially when we think about teachers at, elementary, middle, high level. They barely make enough to really, sustain themselves, despite their importance in building up, the next generation. Mm-hmm. They are very literally the people who are helping shape the future of the country. Yet, to this day, they're still just underfunded, undercompensated, underappreciated, which is quite sad to think about all that. But I would hope that, one day we will come around. Whether that happens or not, I don't want to, I'm not going to hold my breath. But I would like to think that there will eventually be a day in which those sorts of people are well taken care of by society.
Mm-hmm. Well, from my perspective, we should pay them a lot more than we pay most people.
Right.
That's a very hard, I couldn't do it.
Right.
No way I could do that. I would fail miserably at that job. And I do teaching for a living as part of my vocation, right? But I couldn't, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. If you're in the school system, you're teaching the same class over and over and over again.
Right.
I can't imagine doing that.
Right.
I mean, I had enough trouble last quarter teaching 2 sections of learning. That was enough to drive me sort of crazy, just trying to keep track of everything.
Right, and you have to do that as a high school teacher, every day, every quarter, every year.
And for 5 times a day,
Right.
or however many sessions they have.
And also I feel too, the jump from pre-college education, pre-collegiate education to college is such a massive jump in terms of how school is structured, the commitment of both the teacher and the student, all of the things you have to be aware of. Elementary school teachers, for instance, not just have to do that, but they also have to know how to take care of kids, be mindful of any developmental, disability condition that kids might be going through. Things like mental health, they're so much more pronounced when you have to, stay with these kids for that long. I can't imagine doing that sort of job too. And I can barely deal with, just doing my own thing, taking care of myself, talking, holding up my social circle. I can't imagine, teachers, whether it's yourself or even elementary, middle, high teachers doing what they do and on so little compensation too. It's pretty nuts.
I have deep respect. They love what they do. Clearly.
Right. Yeah. Just to end on, a higher note than that. Obviously we've been talking about a lot of things that are sort of, feel, add to that sort of doom and gloom feel, but is there anything recently that you've experienced, read, seen that you sort of feel appreciative or hopeful of? Or just, something that made you feel good that you'd like to highlight?
I have to think about that. Okay, so here's one that's I think fits this moment. Mm-hmm. So let me start by saying I don't know that I feel the doom and gloom. Like there's bad stuff out there, but there's always been bad stuff out there.
Right.
And as a world community, we've managed to right these things when they've gone in weird directions. In the late 1930s, Germany was beginning to try and take over the world. And the world responded to that in an appropriate way, and it led to this period of great prosperity. So I don't see this particular time as anything more than sort of part of this cycle of what happens. And I see students here and how dedicated and committed they are, and that gives me lots of hope. So I don't want you to end with this is doom and gloom. So the thing that we've been watching at home, this is almost a guilty pleasure, perhaps. There's this series called Old Enough, and I think it's on Netflix. And it's a Japanese show where they're following kids that are 2 or 3 years old, and the episodes are 8 minutes long, and the kids are sent out on errands. So here are these 2-year-old little babies given an errand to go down the street and take their dad this thing and get a soda and go to the store and do this other thing and come home. And it's incredibly cute. It's so adorable and heartwarming and uplifting to see this family working together, loving their kids, the kids out in the world, having this adventure. It's remarkably good television for me.
No, I completely understand that. Yeah, if I'm to be honest too, whenever I think about things that give me hope, it's always small things, right? Things either within my family, seeing my grandmother so often, small things that I see in the community, watching people, rally behind people who might be affected by the floods recently or, COVID. It's always like those small things that really give you warmth, right? When you look at things on too big of a scale, it's too much to handle.
Right. But, even when disasters happen, like the earthquakes that just happened in Turkey and surrounding areas, the news, one way to spin that is doom and gloom, earthquakes have happened, people have died in these situations. But on the other hand, there's this community of people that are bringing aid.
Right.
And that always happens with disasters. There are always people who drop everything to go bring aid and support in some way. And that always gives me hope, realizing that we still do that. In spite of our political differences, if there's something going on that's a disaster in the United States, people rise to the occasion and they sort of forget about the political differences, at least in the moment.
Right.
And so that to me is a hopeful note of, I don't see the doom and gloom. I mean, I recognize there are lots of problems going on, and it certainly feels sort of exaggerated, maybe because of the pandemic having happened, still happening, that we're all sort of still smarting from that.
Right.
Maybe. I don't really know. I'm speculating, but I like to remain hopeful.
Yeah. No. Well said. Yeah. With that in mind, we are running out of time right now. So is there anything you'd like to promote, shout out to people who might be listening at home?
The Santa Clara Psychology Department. We've got a great major. We have good students.
Yeah, I'd like to second that as well. Shout out to the SU Psych Department. Amazing professors, some of the best classes I've had on campus. Great people to talk to, great experiences, and supporters of the podcast too, because it's the third episode in a row. Yeah, with that in mind, Dr. Bell, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and I wish you the best of success with the podcast. I'm looking forward to putting it in my ear.
Of course. Thank you. And once again, thank you to everyone listening at home, and with that in mind, signing out. This episode of Ruminations was made possible by Dr. David Zhang and the Santa Clara University Imaginarium. You can check us out on campus at HEFE 237 or visit our website at www.scu.edu/imaginarium.